Welcome. My name is Paul Grimm. I am the David Affiliati Professor of the Practice of Law and the Director of the Bolch Judicial Institute here at Duke Law School. The Bolch Judicial Institute was founded in 2018 through the very generous donation of Carl Bolch Jr., who was a 1967 graduate of Duke Law School, and his wife, Susan Bass Bolch. The mission of the Bolch Judicial Institute is to study and advance the rule of law, judicial independence, and law reform through technology and innovation. We are so delighted to have Susan Bolch here with us today. And I'm also pleased that we have a member of our Bolch Judicial Institute here with us, Peter Kahn, who's our director, who has been so instrumental in all of the things that we've been able to do. And also, it's a great pleasure to welcome Chief Justice Newby of the North Carolina Supreme Court and his wife, Megan. Now, each year, the Carl and Susan Bolch Prize for the Rule of Law is awarded to either an individual or an organization that has demonstrated extraordinary dedication to the rule of law and advancing rule of law principles in the United States and internationally. This year, we are honoring the late United States Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And it's my special honor to welcome Justice O'Connor's son, Scott O'Connor, and his wife, Joni, who are with us here today as we celebrate the remarkable career of Justice O'Connor. In addition, I'd like to welcome Judge Bob Dow from, I almost said the late Judge Dow, who is here representing the United States Supreme Court. Judge Dow, we're so grateful to have you here as well. Justice O'Connor's career was nothing short of path-breaking. She was a lawyer, a state legislator, a state court judge, and of course, the first woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court. We're also here to honor her groundbreaking work in civic education. Justice O'Connor knew better than all the rest of us that for the rule of law to thrive, the public must be continuously educated about our government institutions, and in particular, the judiciary. After she retired from the court, Justice O'Connor founded iCivics, which today reaches millions of children in school and in educators with games and lessons about our government. Actually makes learning about civics fun. Now, as we approach finals, I'm sure that all of our students would be happy to know that if you're looking for a fun break at the end of the semester, you can go to iCivics, and they actually have civic education games for law students. So you can find out whether you know more civics than a fifth grader does. Today we will have the opportunity to really learn about the legacy of Justice O'Connor from three of her former law clerks. We had hoped to have a fourth member with us today, Tracy L. Lovett, a partner at the law firm of Jones Day, and a member of the Duke Law Board of Visitors. She unfortunately has been stuck in that storm in New York, which has grounded all air traffic for quite some time. But we are thrilled to have three distinguished lawyers and scholars with us today. Professor Lisa Griffin is the Candace M. Carroll and Leonard B. Simon Distinguished Law Professor here at Duke Law School. She clerked for Justice O'Connor from 1997 to 1998. Professor Matt Adler is the Richard A. Horowitz Distinguished Professor of Law and Professor of Economics, Philosophy, and Public Policy here at Duke Law School. And he clerked for Justice O'Connor from 1992 to 1993. And Sarah Boyce is the Deputy Solicitor General of the North Carolina Department of Justice. She is a graduate of Duke Law School and clerked for Justice O'Connor and Justice Stephen Breyer in 2015 and 2016. We would also like to welcome our own Dean Kerry Abrams, the James B. Duke and Benjamin N. Duke, Dean of Duke Law School and a distinguished professor of law. She will lead our discussion today. Thank you all for being here. And Dean, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you so much again to everyone, the O'Connor family, Susan Bolch, all of our visiting dignitaries, and students and faculty and staff for turning out today to honor the legacy of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. I'm so excited that we have 3, even though we hope to have 4, clerks, former clerks of Justice O'Connor here to help us all learn more about what she was like as a person, a justice, and a proponent of civics education. And so I thought maybe we could start with something that I think the students would love to hear about, which is really what was it like to clerk for Justice O'Connor? What was it like to be in her chambers? How did she use her law clerks? So perhaps all 3 of you can tell us a little bit about what your role was working with the justice. Maybe we can start with, Sarah, do you want to start with you?
Sure. I'm happy to start, though I probably had the least conventional clerkship with Justice O'Connor. So as you may have gathered from the years that I clerked for Justice O'Connor, I clerked for the justice after she had retired and was actually her last law clerk before she stopped having clerks anymore. And the relationship between the justices and the clerks once they've retired can look different depending on how the justices choose to continue to be engaged. Justice O'Connor, of course, chose to remain quite engaged after her retirement in a range of different ways, both continuing to sit on the courts of appeals, but also in building this wonderful organization, iCivics. And she really saw it as her mission to spread civic awareness throughout the country. So some of the things that she leaned on me to help with were some of the iCivics work. So I got to know some of the folks who were involved in that organization. She was still writing and had published several, or committed to publish several law review pieces while I was clerking with her, and I would work with her on those. My term was the year that Justice Scalia passed away. So one of the most interesting things that I did with Justice O'Connor was work through some of her public remarks that she issued in the wake of Justice Scalia's passing. And it was a wonderful experience to get to hear about her relationship with Justice Scalia and her memories of him. But the best part of my clerkship with Justice O'Connor was just that she would call regularly, presumably to hear about the life of the court, but really just to get to know me and hear what was going on with me. I had gotten married about 2 months before I started with Justice O'Connor, and she was very invested in the success of that relationship. And so I would, start any phone conversation with her, trying to describe the cases that we were working on and what was happening with my clerkship with Justice Breyer, who I was also assigned to. But she would quickly move to, and how is Michael? How are things with Michael? And she would encourage me to prioritize that relationship. And we really developed a really special bond, sharing stories from just how our lives were unfolding. So again, a less conventional relationship than perhaps the ones you'll hear about from my friends over here, but a very special one nonetheless.
So Matt, do you want to talk about a more conventional one?
Or just sort of the work of the clerk. So let me say, so the year before, I was privileged to clerk for the Honorable Harry Edwards on the DC Circuit. Judge Edwards is still on the bench, nearing his 40th anniversary. That job, the central work of that job, was twofold. First of all, when a case was set for argument, the cases were divided among the clerks, and each clerk was tasked with writing a bench memo, right, based on the briefs and the clerk's own legal research. And then if the judge ended up writing in a case, either majority or dissent or concurrence, then the clerk would write an initial draft, right, and then work with the judge on doing that. So when I was privileged to move from that clerkship to clerking with Justice O'Connor, the first 2 parts of the job remain the same. Right? The court granted cert on cases. Those cases were divided up among the clerks. There were 4 clerks in that case as opposed to 3 for the Court of Appeals, and each clerk would write a bench memo based on the briefs. There were a lot more briefs, but synthesizing those, still a 15-page bench memo. And then if the justice ended up writing in a case, we would write an initial draft. The third part of the job, which was not part of the job on the Court of Appeals, was the cert process, right? And the justices, I think at that point, except for one, were all part of a cert pool. So that you would write a short memorandum. The court at that point, even more so now, received thousands and thousands of cert petitions, and so you would read those petitions and write a short memo, which went to the entire pool. I mean, those were the 3 parts of the job. There also were emergency matters, but most of the job was those 3 parts. Now, my year, there were 2 offices, 2 clerks' offices downstairs, 2 upstairs. The more extroverted clerks chose the downstairs offices. I was happy to be upstairs because there was a lot of work and I wanted my work to be done. But the justice, every week before argument on cases, had us all get together on Saturday where we'd all, read the bench memos in advance and we would talk about those with her. She would also make us lunch. And then, of course, if she ended up writing and we, as the clerks, were doing a first draft, we would then talk to her a lot about that. But that was essentially the job.
So I won't repeat what's been said. I do want to say how proud we are of Sarah Boyce, though. It doesn't make me feel any younger that one of my students was Justice O'Connor's last clerk, but it does make me feel extremely proud. And we're glad to have her come back to Duke every time she does. And it's really meaningful to all of us, the many, many things that she's accomplished since she graduated. And I agree with the tenor of Sarah's remarks, and I'll pick up where she left off with the personal dimension of working for Justice O'Connor, because though we did work very, very hard, Matt is certainly right about that, and the list of things we did that he described can certainly give you that impression. I would add to it that I wrote a lot of the justice's speeches. I helped her prepare, like Sarah did, published works that she had pledged to contribute to various outlets, and there was a lot of writing and there was a lot of work, and she was the sort of person who explored every corner and checked every box and examined every word. So there was a lot of time that went into getting things right, but there was a lot of generosity on her part that went along with that. She shared herself with us, and she cared about us as people, and very much looked out for our well-being on every dimension, including the personal ones, like how things are going at home. And I think that one of the embodiments of Justice O'Connor and what it was like to work for her is a sort of talisman that was on a wall in her office. I don't know if Sarah ever had the experience of this. No one really knows the provenance of this piece of paper, but there was a Xerox of the justice's hand that she loved a joke, and someone had made a photocopy of her hand, taped it on the wall, and on the piece of paper it said, "For a pat on the back, lean here." And what that meant is she didn't effusively praise anyone, and she was tough, and she did work hard, but she showed how much she cared about us by actually taking care of us. And it's the same way I think that she showed how to do things by actually doing them. She was a model for getting things done, for working hard, and for setting an example. And that's what she was in every dimension.
I'll have to remember that.
Kerry might need one of those as well.
I think I might put a photocopy for the pat on the back. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about something that was unusual about Justice O'Connor, which was her experience in all 3 branches of government before becoming a Supreme Court justice. So unlike her colleagues, she had served in her home state of Arizona as a state senator, as an assistant attorney general, and as a state court of appeals judge. And that's a pretty unusual mix of experiences for a Supreme Court justice to have, and I think might lead to a different understanding of the role of the Supreme Court, the role of the judiciary vis-a-vis the other branches. So I'm curious what our panelists think about that, and I'm going to take the first stab at it because even though Tracy Lovett couldn't be here today, she emailed me this morning some things she wanted me to share. So while she's stuck in New York in the storm. So her take on this issue is this. She felt that the justice was very influenced by her time in the state legislature. And she talked a lot about how she could resolve any impasse during her time in state government by inviting the leaders of the opposing factions to her house, getting everyone around a fire, and pouring some drinks. In her experience, face-to-face conversations in a welcoming environment would always lead to common ground. So she took that experience to the court And you would often see her walking from the Chief's chambers to Justice Breyer's chambers to Justice Souter's chambers and back to the Chief's chambers. It was shuttle diplomacy to attempt to find a middle ground. And then Tracy concluded her comments by saying, in her view, the court's institutional credibility required more 6-3 and 7-2 opinions than 5-4. That's why sometimes her opinions can read like incremental changes in the law. She really wanted that sixth vote. Other thoughts on how her experience in all three branches might have influenced her as a justice?
I think this is one of the most important and least remarked upon things about Justice O'Connor as her legacy has been discussed since her passing in December. In 1954, when the court decided Brown versus Board of Education, there was one justice who had previously served as a federal judge. And when Justice Alito replaced Justice O'Connor, all 9 justices came to the court as federal appellate court judges. And it does make a difference, and it was really meaningful and significant in terms of how she viewed the importance of consensus, which is what Tracy's comments are referring to. She really felt that the 3 branches of government were sort of orbiting each other, and that there were gravitational forces between them that sometimes pushed them apart and sometimes held them together, and that they were all engaged in an ongoing conversation. And she had served in all 3 branches of the Arizona state government, and she had a profound understanding of the sorts of decisions that belonged in different fora. And so I do think that it heavily influenced her jurisprudence, and I do think it's a lost perspective on the court, both the importance of the legislative approach to certain kinds of problems and the sense of an ongoing conversation that involves a balance of power. The current court is more in the maybe the sun orbits the earth instead of the other way around vein. And that sense of the solar system, which by the way, was a metaphor that the framers very much had in mind when they came up with the whole structure of our government, is a little bit faded. And I think it's one that she lived and set an example for with those incremental decisions and that effort to build consensus and that effort to have discussions. When she came to the court, the justices almost exclusively communicated in writing through memos. And after she'd been there a short while, they had lunch together on a regular basis. And she cared about that discussion as a metaphor as well as a concrete expression of the discussion that she wanted everyone to continue having.
So, yeah, I think one important aspect, and I completely agree with those fantastic remarks. One important aspect of her perspective as a former state legislator was her appreciation of the importance of state sovereignty, right? That runs through her opinions. So in 1992, she authored the court's majority opinion in New York against the United States, right? Which put in place the so-called anti-commandeering provision, right? The federal government had basically ordered the states to, after a certain point, take ownership of low-level radioactive waste within their states. And New York against the United States says no. Right? Congress can't do that to the states, right? The states are not simply sort of regional divisions in federal government. They're freestanding sovereign entities, right? You can't, there are lots of ways that the federal government can regulate within the states, can induce state action by spending, but you can't directly commandeer state legislatures, right? That was infused by her understanding of, the importance of legislation, but also the importance of the states. I would recommend reading that opinion. It stood the test of time. Half decade after that, that was extended in the Prince case, and it's proved to be important both in protecting Democratic state legislatures from Republican commandeering, but vice versa. It's a truly, I think, transsubstantive, important principle, which again, was authored by Justice O'Connor in light of her understanding of the importance of the states and the importance of legislatures.
The only thing I'll add is a personal anecdote, and that is to Professor Griffin's point about the lunches and how important it was to use those as a means of dialogue and building consensus. As I mentioned earlier, I also clerked for Justice Breyer. That was the active justice to whom I was assigned. And Justice Breyer had a regular practice of meditating after lunch, which we knew was code for a short nap, but he insisted that he was meditating. And after argument, he would often come back and lament that he couldn't go meditate right away, but he would always look me in the eye and say, Sandra always said we had to go to lunch. And so he would make his way upstairs and very faithfully go to lunch, because I think her legacy of impressing upon the justices how important that was to maintaining relations at the court and looking for ways that they could find consensus amongst the many difficult decisions that they deal with outlasted her actual presence at the court. And I just think he cherished that, and it's something that was very meaningful to me that many justices, him included, but all of the other ones that were still there, clearly seemed to prioritize past the time she was there.
So maybe we can turn to the topic of civics. We've talked a little bit about one of the things that we're all here to honor Justice O'Connor for, which was her contribution to civics education, and we've heard a little bit about iCivics. I'm wondering if her dedication to civics education influenced your experience as clerks. Like, is that a topic that she discussed with you? Did you experience your clerkship as an education around the importance of democracy or the importance of the American judicial system?
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, absolutely. And again, it's been commented how much he cared about the community. Let me back up. I saw in the court, when I was privileged to clerk on it, and that's more than 30 years ago now, and in her role, a well-functioning court. The court struck me as well-functioning. I would sort of describe it as a community of principle, a community united by principle. So on the one hand, I mean, the basic work of the court was done by circulation of draft opinions, right? The court would go, hear argument, reach an initial decision, right? Someone to write the majority was assigned, and then that person would write a draft, which was then circulated to all the chambers, right? And other justices would decide to join. A justice might say, again, by circulating a memorandum, I will join, but only if you change this paragraph to say this, right? Meanwhile, another justice might decide to start circulating a dissent or a concurrence, right? And so the basic work of the court was done by writing, right? Where, not through horse trading, right? But by draft memorandum, which over time, right, and through written interaction, accumulated enough votes, right, to make a full opinion and perhaps concurrences and dissent. So that's the principal part, but it's also a community. The justices ate lunch together, and O'Connor, Justice O'Connor was important to that as well. I saw her, as a central actor in both roles. So yeah, I walked away from the clerkship saying, to everyone who had listened to me, whatever you think about the court's decisions, the court, and again, this is in 1992 for me, is a well-functioning institution.
Yeah, I mean, I think often about just how prescient Justice O'Connor was with respect to her emphasis on civics, because when we would talk about it, and again, iCivics was her favorite thing to talk about. It seemed like it was perhaps the thing she was the most proud of, even beyond being the first woman on the court. She was so proud that she had built this remarkable organization that was helping high school students and even younger understand our democracy. But she would lament the fact that she didn't think that either children or adults anymore understood the way our government worked, why our government was remarkable, and why it needed to be cherished and cultivated and maintained. And at the time, I don't think I really understood why she cared so much or what she clearly could see in the distance. And I'm not going to make this a partisan speech or anything like that, but I certainly think that she was prescient and that her message that this is work that has to be ongoing and that we need to take seriously and elevate is really important, particularly so today. So that has certainly stuck with me and is something that I hope we will continue to remind one another of.
I agree with Sarah that the justice thought of civics education as a very significant core to her legacy, and that she cared about it a lot, and that she saw in advance of a lot of other people the importance of educating the citizenry about how our democracy works. She would say that it's not passed down in the gene pool, it has to be taught to every generation, and that's what iCivics is all about. And what I truly love about that is that there's a lot of commentary in recent months about if her legacy is particular decisions, which I don't think she would ever have said that it was in any way, then those change over time, and some very significant ones have. But I don't actually think that's her primary legacy. I think, obviously, breaking down incredible barriers and setting such a graceful and profoundly capable example for everyone who followed, including the 5 women who followed her to the court, is a huge part of her legacy. And I think that this consensus and incrementalism and moderation and process is a huge part of her legacy, not the substance of the decisions, but the way that she arrived at them. And I think this idea of an engaged citizenry and of passing down the ideals of democracy and her intense love for the republic itself. It's true that she did not have a grand vision of jurisprudence, but she did have a grand vision of the republic itself. And I think it's very fitting that iCivics is noted as her significant legacy, and I think that she would actually love that.
So I think the question of legacy is really interesting, and I love how you've framed it in multiple ways. On the part about her incrementalism and the kind of process of the decisions, I'm wondering if our other panelists also have thoughts about kind of her legacy as a jurist.
Yeah, I mean, the justice is sometimes described somewhat disparagingly as a pragmatist. I think that's wrong. I mean, I think she certainly was sensitive to the actual effects of her decisions. So, for example, the fact that prior to the Greta decision, many corporations and other institutions submitted amicus briefs, attesting to the importance of diversity was certainly a factor for her. But she was much more than a pragmatist. I would characterize her, the jurisprudence, and the approach is consistent, as a values-based constitutional judging within a system of precedent. So the incrementalism is the fact the court, is bound by precedent. That doesn't mean it never overrules decisions, right? She articulated, or the joint opinion in Casey that she joined articulated, a very sensible framework for stare decisis. But it's a system of precedent, but as I said, it's also values-based. That's not to say that Justice O'Connor ignored original meaning or ignored history and tradition. She certainly looked to those, but those were only, I think, for her jumping off points for also taking into account constitutional values. So, for example, if you look at the anti-commandeering decision that I mentioned earlier, I mean, there is some discussion of the Federalist Papers and what the Federalists thought about commandeering. By the way, that evidence is split. There's no clear evidence, right? And in fact, that issue is played out, at length in the debate between Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens in the later Prince case. So, the original evidence about the permissibility of commandeering is split. Rather, Justice O'Connor relies upon the values of federalism. The importance of state sovereignty in terms of protecting people from tyranny, and the importance of accountability to a system of federalism. And I think again, if you look at her decisions, you're going to see an emphasis on values, along with original meaning, history and tradition, and precedent. We often associate values-based judging with the Warren Court, and that's true. I view her as an example of a value-based judge in a more centrist register. And I think, 30, 40, 50 years hence, we will have, really renewed appreciation for that.
I think Justice O'Connor's jurisprudence is another way that you can see very clearly the impact of having been a legislator and an attorney in the executive branch, because those are obviously positions that are more directly accountable to the people, tend to engage with constituents on a much more regular and direct basis. And I think you can sense in the many opinions that have garnered her the name pragmatist, the extent to which she cares about the impact that the decisions were going to have on people in a very real and meaningful way. And I think that drove her decisions to a large extent. And I think somewhat correspondingly, it was driven by her sense that, or her deep care and concern for the court as an institution, and her sense that if opinions didn't make sense to people and they didn't think that the law was interacting with their lives in a way that they could respect, that was going to harm and tarnish the reputation of the court, and in turn damage our country's respect for the rule of law. and the need for our judiciary to be maintained as a unique institution. So I think those derive from her life experience, and regardless of the opinion, you can see that deep concern and empathy and sense of the stakes for real people as a driving force behind much of what she said and did.
I think that's right. I think another way of putting it is that it was very facts-driven. I mean, it's true that there were values and it's true that there were institutional considerations that drove a lot of her thinking, but she really, really focused on the facts and on the practical implications, and also on the way in which the future might involve changed circumstances. That's what made her so pragmatic, is her awareness that this court is not the primary driver of social change, that things are happening in the external world that are probably going to have a lot more to do with that than any pronouncement from the court. And she really was attuned to the way in which the future would bring new circumstances and new ideas, and that the court needed to be able to some degree keep pace with that. I also agree with Sarah. She was the most confident and self-possessed person in whose presence I have ever been. So she did not much worry about what other people thought of her, but she did care what other people thought in general. And she was very attuned to not just consensus among her colleagues, but the community as a whole. Her colleagues have remarked in many different venues that no one other than her ever had quite that knack for knowing where the country was, for knowing what people could accept at any given time, and for knowing where we had arrived in terms of social progress. So she really was close to the ground, I think closer to the ground because she was so practical, because she had life experiences than some of her colleagues, and very attuned to the facts and very aware of changing circumstances.
So this, I think, is mostly a question for Lisa and Sarah, but, obviously one of the most biggest aspects of Justice O'Connor's legacy was as the first woman appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. What was it like being a female clerk for the first woman? And how much did that matter to her? Did that come into her mentoring of you in any way? Did you learn from her what it was like to be a woman in a male-dominated profession? Was that something that she was aware of and discussed?
It mattered to her a lot. She was, of course, aware of it, largely because she always would say, it was good to be the first, but you certainly don't want to be the last. Sure. So she cared a lot about keeping people always talk about her being a trailblazer, and I think that's hugely appropriate for the daughter of ranchers from Arizona. She indeed was. But she actually probably would have described herself as a bridge builder more than a trailblazer. She wasn't really trying to set things on fire. She was trying to make sure that others could follow her. And so I do think that she was profoundly aware of the importance, not just of the fact that she was doing it, but of how she did it, the sort of dignity and capacity that she displayed at all times made it possible for not just judges, but politicians and lawyers and women in every profession to see themselves. She changed our collective consciousness about what women can do. She was the most powerful woman in the country when she was on the court. People sometimes called it the O'Connor court. And that sort of discourse changes not only how women see themselves, but how men see what women can do. So there's no question that she was deeply aware of it, but she was also a very traditional person. And her way of engaging with it was to try to set an example of someone who could stay above the fray. So I think one of the things I learned from her about being a professional woman is not to take things personally. No one has ever been better than Justice O'Connor at letting things go and keeping her eye on the future and not taking things personally. She did not. She talked a lot about the importance of being kind. She let things go when her colleagues were quite insulting. She took lines out of draft opinions if she thought they were in any way, in her words, snippy. She was always willing to let a disagreement be in the past. She never dwelled on any disappointments, and she did not take things personally. And I think that actually is one of the ways she conserved the energy she had to accomplish so much.
One of the things that I admire the most about her as a woman in a male-dominated profession is that she didn't seem to feel the need to take on sort of the male personality that you might feel compelled to emulate. I know even as a young lawyer myself, I would go to, deposition trainings or mock trial kind of events, and often the personality type that you see is just sort of like the TV lawyer who's loud and bold and brash, and that didn't fit me at all. And I, for a long time, had a concern that if I couldn't emulate that and take on that mantle of the more masculine, dominant lawyer, that it was going to be hard to succeed, because maybe that's what clients were looking for. And I think Justice O'Connor is such a stark departure from that, because to Professor Griffin's point, she did still maintain a lot of traditions and what some would call, female stereotypes, but that was who she was to her core, and she didn't feel the need to change it just because she had entered a male profession. She embraced the fact that she thought cooking food brought people together and was a way to build bridges. She did believe in things like wearing your skirt suit to an interview or to work every day, and she didn't feel like she needed to adjust her personality. She felt like, this is who I am. I'm going to proudly be this person, and people are going to slowly see the ways in which having a woman in this space is an asset, a benefit, and is a way to improve this institution. So that was always very comforting to me, and I hope is comforting to others to have witnessed, to see that there's a place in the legal profession for everyone, irrespective of your personality or irrespective of the way that being a lawyer looks and feels comfortable to you. And it's something that I have always cherished about the example that she set.
Matt, you had a different experience. What was that like?
My year, and I think most years, there were 2 male clerks and 2 female clerks, right? And so there's a sense in which gender mattered, and there's a sense in which it didn't matter. In our interactions, did not matter at all. Did not matter at all. But obviously, she wanted to have a diverse group of clerks. And to your comment about cooking, she fed us on Saturday mornings, right? Now, which is very nice. Otherwise, I would have stopped by some, greasy spoon on Capitol Hill and brought in some really bad food. So, but we sat together, and then we talked about, in a civil way, the cases. She also, again, in this very caring way, there was a lot of work, and she wanted us to do the work. I mean, we had to do the work. That was the most important thing.
You said Saturday.
Well, so Saturday.
I noticed that.
Oh, yeah, Saturday. Well, Saturday. What's Saturday, right? Saturday's a work day. Saturday's a work day. But she would periodically just sort of buzz us down and say, we're going to the Arboretum. We're going to go to the Arboretum. Like, I would not otherwise have gone to the Arboretum. But we're going to go to the Arboretum and see this new exhibit. Or we're going to the National Gallery, and we would go to the National Gallery, and it would be only us. And, part of me would be like, wow, the 5 of us are here, 4 of us and Justice O'Connor at the National Gallery, looking at these paintings. That's half of my brain. Half of my brain is, I need to get back to my office to work on, but yeah, she wanted us to do the work, obviously, held the work to the highest standard, also wanted to, help us continue to have and to broaden other aspects of our life.
This might be a good opportunity to share another Tracy Lovett story. Tracy shared with me an article she published soon after Justice O'Connor passed away, in which she credits Justice O'Connor for her marriage. And she talked about the stress break visits that Matt was just talking about. She said during the stressful times, she would just plan these field trips for the clerks to get them out of the office, out of chambers. And they went to museums and arboretums, and sometimes would just go for walks on the National Mall. She said at the end of the term, when Tracy was clerking, she planned a sea kayaking trip. Were you on this trip? Did you clerk the same term as Tracy?
Every year there was a nature outing, but mine was different.
Okay. It was a sea kayaking trip down the Potomac River for clerks and their partners. And Tracy said, unlike her co-clerks, she did not have a partner, and she didn't know who to invite. Justice O'Connor decided to take matters into her own hands. scheming with the late Justice Antonin Scalia, she invited Ara Lovett, you may notice Tracy's last name is now Lovett, who she referred to as that Scalia clerk who keeps hanging around chambers, to be Tracy's sea kayaking partner. And that Scalia clerk and Tracy were married a few years later. Later on, when they had kids, Justice O'Connor sent them SOC Grand Clerk t-shirts. What was your trip, Lisa?
We went hiking.
Okay. No matchmaking on that trip.
I was already married.
So, what if...
Safe from Justice O'Connor's matchmaking.
If she were still with us, what would you seek her advice on today? What do you think she would tell us personally or about the state of our nation today? And what would you want to know from her?
Don't know what she would say, or I wouldn't want to presume what she would say, but I ask her how to deal in a nation where democracy and the rule of law are under threat, what to do. I think she has something to say.
She was such an optimist. I mean, there are moments where I'm glad that she's not processing everything that is happening, but at the same time, she would never have given up on us. She was such an optimist. And so I would, that voice, that optimistic, generous, determined voice would be a balm, I think, for a lot of people in the somewhat dispiriting times as far as our civic discourse goes we might find ourselves in. But she would not have, no way would she have given up on the idea of how we could all get along in a multiracial democracy. Absolutely not. She would have all sorts of thoughts about what we should do. And I think the most reassuring thing would be her determination and her optimism about it.
Mine is much less grandiose, I guess, but one of the things that I've most admired relates to her role, I guess, as a trailblazing woman, and that's the way that she balanced her family and her fierce ambition. I mean, obviously, she was willing to move her whole family from Arizona to Washington and raise them there, but at the same time, as I'm sure almost everyone here knows, when her beloved husband got sick, she stepped away from the court far sooner than perhaps many would have expected her to do, and just her innate sense of how to balance the deep, deep love she had for her family with this fierce ambition that she had, and her role as a trailblazer and an American hero. I deeply admire, and I can only hope to have a glimmer of the gift that she had for knowing when to push in one direction and pull in one direction. And so would have loved to have had her advice to navigate me throughout my career, but I'm so grateful for the example that she set in that regard.
We've heard several interesting stories from you. Are there additional anecdotes that are some of your favorite memories of Justice O'Connor that you haven't shared?
Two quick ones. First does not reflect very well on me. Second, maybe a little better. The first is my mother was visiting the court for the day, so got a seat for her at argument, showed her around, and then we were scheduled to meet with Justice O'Connor. And so we walked into the office, and then I proceeded to say, well, I have to go do some work. And I went back to my office. Justice O'Connor met with my mother for an hour. Talked to her. My mother was petrified. My mother is a very extroverted, very accomplished person, but she was still, kind of nervous. I mean, again, does not reflect very well on me, but shows Justice O'Connor's basic kindness, humanity, sensitivity for other people. Yeah, incredible. The other
delegation.
Yeah, I mean, like, great to see you, Mom. I'm off to work. The other story maybe reflects a little better on me, but I think also reflects well on her is, so I interviewed for the clerkship during my third year of law school. That's at a time when the justices often hired clerks right after a first clerkship. So I already had my first clerkship set up, so just a third year law student. I was prepared for the interview, general questions about what I wanted to do, about the court and so forth. At the end of the interview, she said, so what do you think is the worst decision of this court? I had not prepared for that question. And I blurted out Bowers against Hardwick, right? Now, this interview was in 1990. Bowers against Hardwick was a 1986 decision, right, holding that there was no constitutional objection to criminalizing same-sex sexual relations. She had joined that opinion. She had joined that opinion. Now, 17 years after that, the court overturned Bowers in Lawrence against Texas, and Justice O'Connor concurred in Lawrence on equal protection grounds. But I had said that the worst decision of the current court was an opinion that she had joined, right, less than 5 years before. She hired me, right? So I think that shows her willingness to listen to others, even though she was very firm in her own views, but her willingness to listen to others, including the views of a pipsqueak, 3L.
One of my favorite stories of Justice O'Connor also relates to my hiring. So I learned that I was going to have an interview with Justice O'Connor, I think a couple weeks in advance, and immediately set to preparing and reading as many of her opinions as I could, which was, she had written quite a lot at that point, and talking to any clerks that I could who had interviewed with her before to figure out the kinds of things she usually liked to talk about and prepare as many answers to questions as I possibly could. And the day before the interview was supposed to take place, I heard from a friend of a friend that she had hired already to fill the spot. She had hired a day or two before to fill the spot that I thought that I was applying for. I thought that I was applying to clerk in the 2014-15 term. And I was, of course, totally crestfallen. I thought I had missed my opportunity. And I just sort of resolved to make the most of the opportunity, enjoy getting to meet an American icon. And if the best that I could do was have an hour-long conversation with Justice O'Connor, that was still going to be more than enough for me. So I went in and we had a lovely conversation. She didn't ask me any of the questions I had prepared for. We really just talked about our lives and our families and our experiences. And towards the end of the interview, I was just sort of agonizing over whether to say anything about the fact that I was grateful for the experience, even though I knew that she had hired somebody else. And I was like, I don't know if that's the right thing to do. Didn't want to say the wrong thing. And finally, as I was leaving, I just said, Justice O'Connor, this has been the honor of a lifetime. And I've heard that you've already filled the position for the 2014 term, but I just want you to know that I would clerk for you in 2050 if that's what it takes. I'll clerk for you anytime you'll have me. And she said, well, that's very kind. Thank you so much for saying that. And I went about my business. She then, this is sort of a brief aside, several weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the Supreme Court, which I assumed had bad news, and just left it sitting on my bookcase and left my house. I didn't even open it because I was like, who sends good news in a letter? This is 2013 or whatever. Came home, eventually opened it, screamed, had to read it again to make sure it was right. But anyway, so fast forward to when I started my clerkship, I was talking to Linda, Justice O'Connor's longtime secretary, and she said, do you know why Justice O'Connor hired you? And I said, my charm, my intellect, charisma. She said, no, she hired you because of what you said at the end of the interview, because you said that you knew she had already hired, but you wanted to clerk for her at any time. And she said, Justice O'Connor said, I like a woman who knows what she wants. And that really stuck with me because I think, she was decisive. She liked women who stood up for what they want. And that's a lesson that has stuck with me. I mean, you can't get what you want if you don't ask for it and go for it. Do it politely, especially if you're talking to Justice O'Connor. But I've always liked that story and what it says about her and what she values.
I love that story. And I think actually it is relevant to, this is canonical, everyone knows that when she graduated near the top of her class from Stanford Law School, she was offered legal secretary positions in the private sector and could not otherwise get a job. Her first job was volunteering for the San Mateo County DA's office, and she got that job by writing a compelling letter about herself to the DA. And then, of course, everything took off from there because she was one of the greatest lawyers of all time and she just needed to get in the door. But she knew what she wanted and she figured out a way to get there. And it doesn't surprise me at all that she said that. And I love that story. My story will be from her retirement, actually. And it's a metaphor more than a story because we've talked a lot about the many lessons of having Justice O'Connor as a mentor and the truly one-of-a-kind world historical person that she was. There's no one like her. And, she teaches us to look only in one direction, which is forward, and not to take things personally, and to, always do the work. There are no shortcuts. You got to chop the wood and carry the water and cross the T's and dot the I's. And these are lessons that she's taught us. I wrote something about her a few years ago where I suggested that before there were a lot of self-help books, she was a lived example of all of these lessons, of the things that we talk about now, like grit and resilience. And one thing we haven't talked about yet is mindfulness, which I don't even know is a word she would have ever used. I'm not sure she would even have known it. But she was the single most focused person that I've ever known. When she talked to you, she made an unnerving amount of eye contact with her piercing gaze, and it honestly felt like the air around her stopped moving. She would hold remarkably still, and she would focus so intently on the present moment whenever she was doing something, whether that was being with her family or talking to her clerks about their personal lives or the work of the court. Whatever it was, whoever was in front of her had her attention. And that's a skill, that listening, that attentiveness, that mindfulness. It's an incredible skill. And in her retirement, at one of her last reunions for her clerks, I don't know if either of you were there, we were on a bus heading to an event in the Arizona desert. She was on the bus with many, if not most, of her clerks. And it was an outdoor event, and it started to rain, which does not happen very often in the Arizona desert, and she was quite perturbed by this. And she looked around at all the clerks around her and said, "Can you believe it? It's raining." And one of her clerks said, "Justice, actually what we can't believe is that you didn't make it stop." And that was the power of her mind and her focus. It seemed to all of us for a moment entirely possible that she could do such a thing. And she laughed and her eyes sparkled and everyone laughed. But there's something to that, because the ability to be that focused on any given moment is an incredible gift, and I think about it a lot.
What other qualities did she have that you've tried to emulate in your own careers, or that you think the rest of us should try to emulate?
I can say just something short, because the thing that I learned from her, I think about at least once a day, and it is actually, I think, what guides my teaching and mentoring, and I hope colleagueship as well. She held people to really high standards, but she was incredibly compassionate at the same time. And those things are not incompatible, and that is the way that I try to be because of her.
Yeah. I guess I'd have to say intellect plus. I mean, if you were in this room now, as a student, as a faculty member, as an alumni, you have the intellect, right? That's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition for success. And I think, she epitomized, for she had the intellect, incredible legal intellect. But it was, and there are people who can make it through, indeed end up as judges, just based on intellect for whatever reason. She had that, but she had so much more, right? She had to have the grit, given her gender and when she was born. And she had, as has been said, the generosity, the humanity, the mindfulness, the attention to the community, right? So, and I see as a law professor where, again, intellect's really important, but the most successful teachers and scholars and institutional citizens among us are not that way just because of the intellect. You got to combine that with many other things, and she's, I think, to me, an incredible example.
Yeah, I think we've covered so much of it already. It's just, she had so many dualities to her, warmth, but also ferocity, compassionate, but also rigorousness. She was so uniquely herself in a way that almost no one else is able to be. And the bravery that comes in that is something I think I certainly aspire to. I'm definitely not there. But yeah, I think we would all be better if we could be half the unique woman she was.
Before I turn it over to a couple.
Scott
Thanks,
O'Connor
Scott.
wants to add something.
Good. Yeah.
I'd offer a story that relates to your conversation in one of your first questions that dealt with Mom's experience in the 3 branches of government. When she was in the state legislature, spanned my life from roughly age 12 to about 17. And right before that, she re-entered the workforce. She worked when I was born, and then when my 2 little brothers were born, and it went from man-to-man defense into zone coverage. She's been in the workforce for a while. When she re-entered, she took a job at the Attorney General's office in the state of Arizona. And because she wanted to be home when we got home from school, she made a deal with Gary Nelson, who was then the Attorney General, that she and another woman lawyer would each work 3/4 time for half pay. Imagine selling that today, you'd be jailed. But as the lowest ranking member of his staff, she didn't get the most plum assignments. She was given an office in the state mental hospital to deal with issues as they came through her door at that facility. Imagine the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This was her daily grind. She saw a lot. It wasn't pretty. Several years later, she was appointed to a vacancy. That's how she found her way into the state Senate, and came to the Arizona Senate with a deep appreciation for how the state was grossly underfunding and really couldn't care less about people exposed to the mental health system. And it took several years of her time in the legislature to finally pass legislation to give it more reasonable, certainly not as much as she would like, but more reasonable funding. And it was one of the very few issues that I remember her coming home talking about, saying, at last, finally, I got something done for a group of people that needed so much, and nobody cares about them. And she knew that she wasn't going to get any credit for that because it was such a tiny population of people in need that there was no credit to be given. Not enough people cared. Years later on the court, they had a case involving what do you do in a capital case with somebody who's developmentally disabled and a minor. She has a tremendous intellectual curiosity, any subject. She loved when you go on these nature hikes, she's constantly quizzing the guides to learn more about what you've just seen. And she decided to research, what do other civilized nations do in this situation? She wrote a footnote in her opinion about, I don't know if it was Sweden, Norway, one of the Scandinavian countries, how they addressed it. And as a result of daring to look outside the United States for what do civilized, compassionate people do in this situation, she received more credible death threats for daring to do that than for any of her abortion case opinions. But that was a subject that touched her deeply, that carried through her entire career. And you can see on, you can just see that arc. And for those of you entering the workforce again after you leave law school, it's an example of the worst assignment you could invent for yourself carried you through that arc to glory.
Thank you so much for sharing your memories. And I think that entire story touches on so many of the themes that we've heard from all the former clerks today, from the focus on facts, the focus on people, the understanding context, and also the making room for your family and your career. It's so interesting to me that part of the reason she was able to be in all those positions was that she was also prioritizing you. And why does someone end up having positions in all 3 branches of government? It's because they're balancing work and family. So we're out of time. This is maybe a good place to end. Please thank everyone, our panelists and the family.